Well, I'm not 100% sure this is working. I apologize. I've had some real technical difficulties here today. So I'm going to try to do this. If it doesn't work, if we don't have it set up, I'll cancel the uh, lecture discussion questions. We're going to do Chapter 4 and Chapter 14 tonight. Chapter 4, Theoretical Foundations of Organization and Organization Change. So we have not a whole lot of slides to go through on this particular chapter 4, and we'll try to get that through to you and get this finished with a small amount of other disturbance as possible. Notice that Burke says there are two theoretical views. One is the open systems theory, and the other is a synthesis of thinking on shifts from physics to the life sciences, which is what this really is. So we're going to talk about the open systems theory. Remember that in an open systems theory here, we're talking mostly about things that stem from cell biology. And we want to use our cells, our bodies, as we talk here. And we think about taking in matter, food, drink, etc., and then giving off energy to keep the organism that we have alive. And of course, we have various and sundry different types of organisms within the body, although it makes up just one organism, one whole complete organism. The open systems theory, as is mentioned here, is not only dependence, but an interaction with. This is not static. We think of our bodies as not being static. We're in something different, where we are in a continual or perpetual type of motion. Now, even when we're sitting still, there is some motion going on. So let's look at this next slide, because this puts it into somewhat of a perspective of things that we know about when we think about how we transform something into something else. Excuse me, I missed a slide here. There we go. And so this is very simple. We think of this as production. Now notice here it says open systems theory and feedback loop, and talks about continuous intake and outtake of energy. But let's look at this at the first step, input being raw material. Now we can think of raw material as before, as I mentioned, food or drink or something of that nature. So we take that in, and then we get this throughput, which this is a transformation. So we transform the raw material into something and produce an output. Okay, the output could be, let's think, additional calories that cause weight gain. Now, when I say weight gain, let's not think of massive numbers of pounds here. Let's just think about putting on weight. We also know if we restrict that input, we're going to still get at a throughput that's going to cause us to lose weight, because we simply have not ingested raw material and transformed that into nutrient. And this is the way we look at transformation of product, or something that becomes a product. Raw material, we put it through some transformation process, throughput, and out comes the material or the good that we're trying to produce. Now, here are the 10 characteristics of open systems. We have 5 on this slide and 5 on the next slide. First one is thinking about bringing in the new. And then, of course, we talked about throughput. That's changing the raw material into something, which becomes our output, a final product, whatever that happens to be. think of number 4 as circulation. It's a continual process, if you will. And then 5, which we don't see real well here on the slide, I apologize for that. We got some, see if I can move this up just a little bit here. As I mentioned earlier, there we go. 5 is what is known as negative entropy. And it's best to think of entropy as a degradation, if you will, of matter. Now let's look at the remaining 5. Let's see if we can get this slide up again here a little bit so we can see number 10. There we go. You can't, it's number 6. Think about this, think about it this way. You can't act upon what you don't know. And you can't act upon things that you don't take in. If you look at number 7, that's really a misnomer, because an open system is not a steady state. It is not dynamic homeostasis. It's in a continual process of change. Differentiation simply is what sets us apart. Integration and coordination, we want to think here of norms and values, which equals our culture. Culture that we see every day, culture at the organization, culture at home, et cetera, et cetera. And the last one simply tells us that there's no one way to success. This particular slide relates to systematic change. Notice it says here that target of change is not the individual. Now, we're speaking of organizations here, and we're not speaking of a small organization where you would only have one or perhaps 2 employees. So you would have to change perhaps 1 employee. Most likely what would happen there is the owner would say, you know, we need to part ways, I need to get somebody else to do something different. But in an organization, we can't just change 1 person and expect things to happen for the better overnight. Now, a lot of times that happens. Organizations get tired, and the board of directors decides to get a new CEO, or the CEO retires or resigns, and so they have to get somebody else. And we always expect that that particular person is going to come in and make massive changes. Well, in fact, he or she can't. Have to come in and see what the culture is. They have to come in and see what the issues are. They have to spend an amount of time getting to know what's going on before any type of changes can happen. So notice this, we're talking here culture. We want people, the groups and individuals, to conform to the norm. I don't mean to be poetic here, and I'm probably not, but that's what you're looking for. And it's very difficult when you have outliers that don't conform to the norm. Now, Burke wants us to take us to what he calls a deeper understanding of organizational change. And Capra's, excuse me here just a second, okay. Capra's accepted criteria for systematic thinking can be found on page 62 in the text. And think of this as an integrated whole. And notice we're taking a shift from physics approach to a holistic approach. So we're thinking of things as an entirety here, as opposed to some other way of breaking it down to some type of differentiation etc. Now here we talk a little bit more about the holistic approach, integrated whole as opposed to a collection of disassociated parts. Now, I suspect the best way to explain this, or at least the best way for me to explain it, is that we are humans. And so let's just take one human and we'll say this particular human is John Doe or Jane Doe. And for some reason, due to an accident or something else, John Doe or Jane Doe loses an arm. Is John Doe or Jane Doe changed? Yes, absent an arm. Is John Doe and Jane Doe, is either one of them still the same? Yes, they're minus an arm, but they're still John Doe or Jane Doe. So that's what we're talking here about. We can't divorce a particular part and say now no longer is that part of the whole. Well, it is no longer part of the whole, but that does not mean that the whole has been changed in any way, shape, or form other than losing this particular part. It's still the whole. Now you would say, all right, it's not as whole as it used to be. I agree to that. And that whole can't do some of the things it used to do. That's also true. But we're still dealing with a person. And so we have not, even though that person has lost an arm, it's still the person. Okay, I hope we can see that. Sometimes that's a little difficult to grasp in a way when you say, okay, well, you're still a whole. Yeah, the person's still a whole. Missing a part, but still a whole, because it's still the same human being. And then we talk here about an ecological approach, which talks about interdependence, and then how nature is cyclic. Now here we're still going on with this deeper understanding of organization change. Systems are living systems are integrated wholes. And so, okay, let's go back to this example of the arm. My arm is distinct from the rest of my body, but the integrated whole has properties that the arm itself does not have. Notice here, part of a system is a pattern and an inseparable web of relationships. That's pretty simple to think about when we stop and think about it. And notice that systems properties follow from the properties of other parts. And we have this overall interrelatedness. So we're going to continue with Capra here. And this has three criteria for understanding. Notice here that key concepts of this pattern are self-organization or self-organizing and autonomous. So this is in a way continual change if you want to look at it. He calls it continuous transforming. Next, Capra speaks of structure. Notice here the key concepts, and we've talked about this before, open to input and output, and then it's dissipative. Here we're talking about, in some cases, the external environment. Now, Burke quotes Pigeon and Stegner or Stenger, I think that's right. Yeah. Uh, as talking about change and stability. Those are not necessarily uncomplimentary thought processes. And one of the reasons we think about it is when we think about stability, and we look at stability and we tend to measure stability over time. And so at part of that time, an organism or an organization will be not as stable as it is in other times. So there's change going on. And the last of his three criteria, again here for understanding life, is process. And notice what he has down here. The key concept is perception. Now, it goes on to say a way of knowing information processing, but remember, and what I want to point out to you here about perception is that perception is reality. And we go through a perception type thing and we decide, okay, this is what we perceive, and it becomes to us the way things are. Now, that may not be true. Things may be different than how we perceive them, but to us, that's the reality. And then as we go along and we get more information and find out more things, we may change our perception. And in fact, if our perception is contrary to fact, or contrary to something that is a given, we either have to change our perception or we're going to become an outlier because we're not accepting certain things. And so we find that all the time. We find people, and I'm not thinking of anybody in particular, that have set perceptions of things and beliefs, even though they're not grounded in reality. They tend to continue with them. And we usually either soft pedal those people. We don't beat them on the head or call them to attention or anything like that. But we realize that that person is really not paying attention to what reality is. And that no matter how much persuasion or logic we can provide, we're not going to change that person's perception. And that becomes very difficult to deal with. And this is what causes or can cause some problems when trying to implement change. This particular slide really boils down to, as far as I'm concerned, awareness. Notice it talks here about organizations interacting between the internal and external environments, influencing, and organizations can always influence internally, cannot always influence externally, but they try to do that for various and sundry reasons, most of them good, because if they don't influence the external environment in some fashion, they're probably not going to be successful. How do you do that? Well, you do it by making a laundry detergent that everybody wants to buy. And so you influence people, in this case, by advertising and promotion, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe having special sales. Maybe it's through demonstration. But you're trying to influence the external environment, that's the vast number of consumers in the world, to use this particular product because it's better, it's less expensive, it has some special ingredients in it, or whatever happens to be. Notice what Capra says here, when there's a disturbance in the environment, either internal or external, whatever structure you have set in place decides to react to that. And it has to decide what disturbance it wants to react to. Now, this follows a law of physics, which says, in a way, which says every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Well, not completely here, but when an action causes something to make the status quo different, if you will, then some reaction is going to happen. For instance, if you get the flu, that's caused by a virus, as we know. Your body is going to try to get rid of that virus, and it reacts to the virus. At the same time, you could have a bacterial infection, which is much different than a virus. It can be cured by antibiotics, assuming the antibiotics work. So you go to your physician, and he or she says, well, you have the flu, and there isn't much we can do for you. We recommend rest and drink plenty of fluids and take some pain medication that you can buy over the counter, Tylenol or Advil or something of that nature. In some cases, and I'm not real sure about this, they may give you some of the flu vaccine if you have not had it, which may help, which may lessen some of your symptoms, although that may not be effective. But you still have this bacterial infection, which in a way is being masked by the virus infection. So the body decides, I have to fight something first. I'm going to fight the virus. So it fights the virus, and you get over the virus, and now you have this bacterial infection, which becomes full blown. So the body has to react to that. So you have to be able to decide here. I've used things that I used to probably be a lot more conversant with than I am today. But when you have some disturbance or disturbances within the organization, and you decide there's a change that has to be done, you have to decide which one you should attack first, because that one that you decide to attack first is going to give you the biggest payback. That's what you're after. What can I do to give me the biggest payback for what it is that I want to do? So that's what this is talking about here. We have to, and it talks about monitoring the external environment and being able to adapt to those changes. That doesn't mean to say it needs to forget the internal environment. But the internal environment can be controlled a lot. Now, that's a tough word to use in a way, because it talks about stricture, and I don't mean that. It can be controlled much easier than you can't control the external environment. You can do some things, and you know, some parts of the external environment I guess you can control, but most of them you can't. So you have to be able to do the things that you can do. And if you can't make those changes and are not effective, you probably aren't going to be able to survive. So that's what this talks about here. And another key word here, and I may have glossed over it, is monitor. You have to know what's going on. And if you can't monitor that, then you're not going to be able to come up with a good solution. Now notice what Capra says here. Cells, let's just work this back to the human body, depends upon the external environment to be able to thrive and survive. Well, yeah, what do we get from the external environment? We get food, we get drink, we get air, we get all sorts of other things. And if we don't have those things, we're not going to be able to survive. And notice that what he says here is within the body, we have differences, but the differences are interrelated and they support one another to eventually support the whole. And finally, notice that he says Capra's comparison with living system goes beyond open systems. But effective change, the change must address the organization's long-term future if it intends to be successful. Now, I just want to, we're at the last slide here, and then we'll get into chapter 14. I just want to stress here for a second or two is that that does not mean and should not be taken to mean that you should not look for some short-term successes and short-term change, which will give you in the term quick wins. Yeah, you should do that, but the focus has to be on long-term survival. If we change this, how successful are we going to be? Is it going to change our business model? What do we have to do to survive? What do we have to do to meet consumers' needs? What do we have to do to meet our competition and be able to do better than they do? So those are all sorts of things that we have to continue thinking about, and that we're going to get perturbed over things, and we have to be selective in the things that we want to do to make the change that we want to make happen and to be effective. Now, I probably rushed through this a little bit, and I didn't mean to. Part of that is having some issues with the technology, and I'm not even sure I have that corrected. I think that I do, but I'm not 100% positive. But we're going to go ahead and we're going to get into chapter 14. I'm going to take a couple-minute break so I can catch my breath, and then we'll get back to get into chapter 14. All right, chapter 14, and I have put chapters 4 and 14 together because I think they're complementary. If you disagree with me, please let me know that, and I'll have another look at how I have set the course up. Chapter 14 is leading organization change, and we're going to talk about some factors here on leading organization change and how we do that. And this particular slide talks about phases of organization change and the leader's role. And the key word here is planning. Planning is, planning, as many of you know, or at least I hope you know, and if you don't know, we'll talk about it here just for a second, is one of the 4 functions of management. Now, we also should say that it's obviously one of the 4 functions of leadership as well, or one of the functions a leader should be able to bring to the plate. But change once it's implemented, and as the slide goes on to say it, as we learned in week 1, change is not linear. And so while change is being planned, and there is a good plan for the change, we have to stop and think, okay, what could throw us off track? And we have to have a contingency plan for what could throw us off track. So there has to be a plan. The plan being we want to get from point A to point B. And then we have to have some contingency plans just in case something happens. Or as the first bullet points out, we might be able to implement phases of the change simultaneously. And so if we do, we have that opportunity, pardon me, and it's something that looks like it's going to be beneficial. Do we have a contingency plan as to how we're going to implement that? So we have to stop and think about it. Now, I think we ought to look at this as the preparation phase here. We have to stop and think about what it is we want to do and how we want to go ahead. We're still talking about thinking about putting the plan into action, pre-launch phase, preparation, if you will. So one of the things we have to do here is we have to understand we're going to live within an environment of unpredictability. And notice the slide here talks about being able to tolerate ambiguity. That's liable to creep into what's going on, and we have to pay attention to this. We also have to be concerned about being able to control things, but at the same time not being micromanagers. What is our preference to understanding how to take action? In other words, should we, as somebody who's an active doer or somebody who's passive, or what else? How do we handle that? Decision making. We have to know when to make decisions, and then after the decisions have been made, we have to let go and let somebody else implement them. And in some cases, not necessarily in all cases. But in some cases, we have to say, okay, our part's finished. Now we have to let somebody else take this over. And again, this goes back to, okay, we've done that. Now we can't be doing any micromanaging here. We talk here about motives, and we could bring in McClellan and his needs for power, affiliation, and achievement. Without going too much into McClellan, and he's not mentioned here in the text, without going too much into him, we can think about what a leader does and what his or her motives are. Power is pretty self-evident. Affiliation is pretty self-evident, although affiliation may tell us that the leader is more interested in relationships than he or she is interested in affecting change. In other words, yeah, he or she wants to affect change, but at the same time, it doesn't want to ruin relationships. And the need for achievements says it's pretty simple. Values, sometimes the values, changes must come from the top. Now, what I mean by that is most often change is at least formulated at the top, planned at the top, not always implemented at the top, because if it is implemented at the top, then that many times is cause for resistance. Now, look what those guys and gals in the corner office are going to have us do now. They don't have any idea of what we're doing down here. So that kind of stuff. So you have to be careful about that. Now we're still here in the pre-launch phase, and we need to stop and think a little bit about what we want here. Again, we're talking about monitoring the external environments. and the external environment, excuse me, I think I put an S on that. We have all of these things, and we need to get information from folks so we can make sound planning decisions. If our customers are going elsewhere, we need to ask our sales force, why are they doing that? Now, somebody would say, well, we need to ask somebody else. We need to ask the folks that actually produce this. Well, they aren't going to necessarily know why the customer doesn't want what's being made. The salespeople should find that out. We need to talk to the information management folks about what we need to do to stay abreast of technology. Normally speaking, we go to see our HR folks to find out about government regulations because they're the ones that deal with those mostly on an everyday basis. Now, of course, that really talks about regulations that affect employees. So other ones that affect the environment and other things, we may have to talk to our legal staff. What's the competition doing? We can get feedback from customers. We can get feedback from the sales force. We can get feedback from some other people as well. And then we have to keep a pulse on what's happening with the economy. If the economy is not good, then we have to think about what we're going to do to be able to maintain where we are. Economy not being good means that people may not be able to purchase what we sell. How do we fix that? We don't fix the economy, but how do we fix that issue that we have within the organization? Still within the pre-launch phase or preparation phase, is however you prefer to do that. We're talking here about providing clarity, vision, and direction. And this brings us back to what we talked about in the past about communication. How are we communicating? People inside. So we have to be clear and concise. We have to tell people why we're moving in the direction we're moving, or we're planning to move in the direction we're moving, and what the end state is going to be. Yeah, there may be some uncomfortableness along the way, but the end state is going to give us a much greater chance of survival than the current state will. Notice what the next one, we have to show these folks, pardon me again, these folks being our employees, why the change is needed. We don't do this, we're going to be out of business, everybody's going to lose their job. Now, of course, it doesn't have to be as strong as I just made it, but it has to be a message that resonates with people, with the employees, so they understand the need for the change. Or conversely, it could be an opportunity to do something different than what we're doing today, which is still within our core competencies. And lets us be better, more nimble, more agile, better able to meet customers' needs and increase our satisfaction rate. And then we've got to get buy-in from the rank and file. That's a term that I like to use quite often. Normally you hear that with unions, and I don't mean it to be associated simply with unions. I mean it to be associated with the people who work for you. If you don't get buy-in from the folks that do the work on a daily basis to make the widgets that you produce, change isn't going to happen. And so that's what I'm talking about there. You've got to get those folks to buy in, plus your change agents and everybody else along the line. But I would say doubly important to get the folks that are making things work to get their buy-in. So we've finished, at least according to Burke, with the pre-launch or preparation phase, and now we're into the launch phase. And here they're talking about the person who is the change agent delivering the message. And as we learned in chapter 1, you have to have someone who is bought into the need for the change and is an enthusiastic supporter of the need for the change. And that person must have great credibility with everyone with whom he or she interacts. Excuse me. Now, okay, say it's a large corporation, let's say 1,000 people or more. That one person is probably not going to interact with everybody, but he or she is going to interact with enough people, and they're going to interact with other people. And so the message you want to be delivered is that this change agent or change agents have a lot of credibility with the people that are direct reports to them, and if there's a lot of credibility there, then there's going to be credibility as it flows down. And people also need to see this person as someone who can affect the change. Now, obviously, no one person is going to affect change. That he or she is going to put the plan into implementation, or maybe I should say it better as implement the plan, and they're going to need other people to help with the change. But that person is the point person. That person is the one that everybody's going to point to and say, George made it work, or Mary didn't make it work, or vice versa. And so it's very important that that person not only have credibility, and I divorced credibility from being seen as a leader of change, because the person selected may not have led change before. But if that person is seen as someone who's progressive, a forward thinker, he or she is going to be successful in trying to do what they want to do. Now, here are some other activities that we have to do, or some activities that need to be done at the very beginning. Get people's attention immediately. We're going to do this because, and the message and the messenger has to stay on message. I mixed up there. I want to say it the way I started to. The messenger has to stay on message. He or she needs to deliver the message in clear, concise terms that everyone can understand. That even goes for the janitor. Now, by the way, I'm not meaning the janitor, but most people who are janitors don't have college degrees. And so we need to talk to the janitor, needs to understand what we're saying here. Then finally, while we're keeping everybody on message here, we need to make sure that people understand we're doing this because we have to do this, and this is not just something we're doing to be doing something. Too often people take change as being that way. We're doing something because we have to, and so we're going to do this. And people see through it right away. It's not been thought out. Nobody knows how to get from point A to point B, and we're just going to be running around in circles chasing our figurative tails. So it has to be a purpose here, and people have to understand why we're doing this. Now, we have to deal with resistance. Resistance is always going to come along, and we're going to see this in various places, whether we want to see it or not. And I want to give you some information that comes from organization behavior textbook that I've used. I don't teach organization behavior any longer, but I still refer to it, and took several organizational behavior courses when I was in graduate school. How do we get through resistance? Well, Schermerhorn, who is the lead editor lead author of the text that I use here. And I'll provide that reference to you in case you're interested in it. He says, he and his fellow authors say that obviously you have to have a resistance to change strategy, and you have to have a resistance to change agent. There's resistance to the change agent, and there's two other things, and how you deal with resistance. Well, he says, he and his co-authors say that you can use education and communication, participation and involvement, facilitation and support, negotiation and agreement, manipulation and coercion, explicit and implicit coercion. So let's go back to the beginning. He says that he and his co-authors say that education and communication is given because people don't have the information and they need that. If you do this, try to educate people and communicate. Obviously, you have to communicate all the time. So let's take that out and only talk about education. If we educate people, you're probably going to get a buy-in from them and a willingness to help. That's an advantage. The disadvantage is it can be time-consuming. Participation and involvement. We're going to get other people involved at buy-in, and especially with those that have the power to resist. If you can get those people on board early on and get them to participate and get them involved, that's going to help you. That also aids in helping plan the change, and it builds commitment to the change by getting those people who might resist on board. It can also be very time consuming. It's the downside. Facilitation and support. Resistance traces to resource or adjustment problems. An advantage of using this method is satisfies directly specific resource or adjustment needs. Again, can be time consuming and also can be expensive. Negotiation and agreement. A person or group will lose something because of the change. That many times happens when you do negotiation. Not always. A lot of times people look at the pie as being fixed. Look at the pie as being able to be enlarged, and that'll work. It does help to avoid major resistance, that is negotiation and agreement. Again, it can be expensive, can cause others to seek similar deals. So in this particular thing, maybe you're negotiating with a particular group, and they see that the other group sees that, and they say, okay, well, we want the similar type deal, or you need a different type deal, or whatever happens to be. Manipulation and coercion and co-optation. Excuse me, I think I said coercion before, and I meant to say co-optation. Other methods don't work or are too expensive. That's the reason you use them. It can be quick and it can be inexpensive. That can create disadvantages. It can create future problems if people sense manipulation. Well, remember we talked about this at the beginning. It's manipulation and co-optation. So you are trying to manipulate people, and most times someone or someones are going to see through that, and that tends to be dead on arrival. And finally, explicit and implicit coercion. You want to use this when speed is important and the change agent has power. Hopefully the change agent always has power, but this is talking about coercive power here. It's quick and it will overpower resistance. It's risky. Now, what the authors here say is it's risky if people get mad, but I say it's risky because if you're overpowering resistance, that does not mean the resistance has gone away. It simply means you've overpowered it. And people will remember that, and they will constantly refer to it until such time as the seething underneath reaches a boiling point. And once it's reached the boiling point, it's going to be very difficult to turn off. So that's what Schermerhorn talks about in dealing with resistance. I wanted to give you a different perspective than what Burke has. Not that Burke has anything that's not good. I just wanted to give you a different perspective. Okay. Now we've gone through the preparation phase, post pre-launch phase, and we've gone through the launch phase, and now we're into the post-launch phase. Further implementation is what this particular slide gives us a little bit more to go on here. Notice what he says here at the beginning, that many CEOs have above average need for control. And because the change is, as we said early on, is not linear, and it kind of goes in a convoluted process or spiral process, let's say convoluted, a spiral process may create some anxiety. And then you may get some ambivalence. Well, maybe we didn't do the right thing. So two things come here. Not only the patience that's on this slide, but the senior leadership has to have confidence in the change agent, that the change agent can do the things that are needed to be done to implement, to push the change forward and get things implemented and going down the path that you want to go. Understanding that it's not going to be linear and it's not going to be straight. So that's what's needed. If you're going to implement change that is for long-term survival, it's probably not going to be something that's done quickly. And if it is, it might be a stopgap to fix a hemorrhage of lost customers or lost profit or both, and then to get on with what really needs to be done further along. Here's some more post-launch further implementation where Burke quotes Heifetz. Be insistent. Now, he says be persistent, but I want to change that just a little bit to say be insistent, because that keeps you on message. Same way with persistent. Stay the course. We need to know what's going to take to be successful. And of course, without trying to beat this over the head again, what is it that we have to do that's going to make us successful? Understanding there are going to be detours. Don't let people get into a, gee, this is pretty good where we are, and we like this area and this pastoral scene, if you will, and we've become comfortable with it. If that's not the end state, they have to move on. Now, so that means there has to be a sense of urgency, if you will, to get beyond this, what it looks like it might be nirvana, to move on to where we need to be. And look out for people that are trying to resist by avoiding things. You know, there's an old saw, if I avoid this, it's going to go away. Well, yeah, sometimes that happens, but you've really not settled anything, because that may come back again. And if it comes back, you're going to have to deal with it then. So avoiding something does not solve a problem. It simply puts it in an area and you can put a damper on it. But that's one of those things that tends to percolate and bubble, and it's liable to blow its top. And it's not going to be something you want to see. Notice what he says here. You need more than one tool in your in your box to create effective change. And there's a lot of things that are talked to on this particular slide. It talks about process reengineering, crafting mission and value statements, etc. Perhaps one of the things that we need to think about here is training and development. If we're going to, pardon me, we're going to make this change, whatever it happens to be, we're most likely going to have to train people to do the things we want done new and different ways. And so we have to pay attention to that. People need to be trained. And we may need to develop people, which is a little bit different than training, for what comes after. And we can train people to do the tasks we need them to do, but then we need to develop people to think about the long term. A new reward system may be something you need to think about. How do we pay people? Maybe we need to pay them differently. Rank and file people, maybe we need salespeople, other people. Maybe we should start a bonus plan or a gain sharing plan or something of that nature. Notice what he starts with here on this particular slide, taking the heat. And that means that the change agent is probably going to have arrows shot at him or her. Because the people that are affected, a lot of them, not all of them, may not like the change. And so, well, they're going to, they maybe shoot the arrows in front of them, so they see them, may shoot the arrows when they turn their back. A couple of things we have to think about here. One we've already talked about, and that is don't be defensive when delivering the message. We got that delivered to us loudly and clearly in chapter 1. And we got part of this other in chapter 1 as well, and that's listen. And when you listen, you need to listen with empathy so that you understand what the person is trying to say, and you put yourself in that person's shoes. And you can't just hear the person. You actually have to listen. And many times they have things that are very important to say, and many times there are other things that we need to hear about. We've talked a little bit about some of this before. Keeping on message, making sure we encourage people. We see that they've done something well, and it's helping the change to single them out, give them praise, make sure that the enthusiasm level stays where it needs to be. That's difficult. We're implementing change. We're going into an area that we don't know a lot about, and we haven't really traversed it very well. New and uncharted territory for us. Difficult to do that. So you need to make sure that the person that you have chosen to be the change agent, and normally that person is also going to be the one delivering the message, pardon me, he stays or she stays upbeat. What this last says is find different ways to get the same message across. You could do posters, you could do bulletins, you could do email messages, you could do social media messages, whatever works. But you have to make sure that that message that you're putting out and maybe changing in some fashion is not seen as just something that's oh well, people can disregard it. That has to be meaningful. And so you have people on your payroll that craft that, and you need to find out where the soul is beating, where the heart is beating. What's important to those people? Craft your message in that way. Again, we're back on a communications kick. Repeat something that's believable. Maybe your organization had a particular hero, and he or she's been lionized, and they were able to do something and took the company to new heights. Talk about that person. And notice that we're embarking on a journey that has specific goals. And we need to keep those goals in mind. Here's where we're trying to go. And as you reach the goal, that goal should be marked off. It should be celebrated. It should be championed, and thank all the people who help get you there, and move to the next one. Again, this is part of communication. And we know there's going to be obstacles. And we have to talk about ways to get over the obstacles. Now, I did not say, and I want to make sure that you understand, I did not say circumvent the obstacles. You need to meet the obstacle and go forward. If you circumvent the obstacle, it means you really never met it. Now we need to sustain what we've been able to put together. And notice here, there complexity theory and life sciences principles that are applicable to changing organizations. This is the one you have to watch out for, equilibrium. People get to that satisfied state and take a deep breath and say, this is great. We're really gotten someplace that's gonna keep us from somewhere else. So we need to be careful about that. Notice what it says here, that living things move towards an edge of chaos. And I don't think we think about that. We tend to think about, we like equilibrium, we're creatures of habit, we like to continue to do things the way we've always done them, and yet we humans are fairly adaptable to change. We may not like it, but we can do that. And sometimes we have to realize that change is inevitable and we have to embrace it. Last one. Living organisms cannot be directed along a linear path, straight path. It doesn't happen. Yeah, if we think about how our body functions, our heart beats and the lungs inflate, or we inhale and exhale and all the things that go on, we do that on a continual basis, and that's some kind of equilibrium. And yet, almost every day, we don't face equilibrium. We find something that causes us to do things differently. So we need to stop and think about that, and celebrate the fact that, yeah, we know about change and we're not afraid of it. Well, we've talked about this right along. Unanticipated consequences. And we have to expect those. Now, in this first paragraph here, if you want to use that, he uses the term self-organized, a new state of equilibrium called refreezing. That's part of Kurt Lewin's 3 steps, the refreezing. And we'll get to that a little bit later in the course. And we have to think about different ways to do things. New solutions is talked about here. And when we are taken out of our comfort zone, it's very frightening to us. And you know, even I use that word, even though when we're taken out of a comfort zone, we may not even think of it as being frightened. We just think, well, okay, I have to do something different. But the point here is that we understand equilibrium, we get to equilibrium status, and yet we know that we're going to have to change for that, from that. So we have to be careful. I don't know that I want to subscribe to the final statement about equilibrium being a precursor to death. I don't know that that's necessarily true. But what I can say is that equilibrium is akin to the status quo. And if we continue with the status quo, we won't accept change. And when change comes and beats us on the head, we won't recognize it. And when the need for change comes and beats us on the head, we won't recognize it. And so then we perhaps will no longer be able to do the things that we thought we were going to be able to do. And if we recognize quickly enough, we may be able to affect the needed change. Otherwise, we probably will not be around where we used to be. Notice what he's saying here. We have an inclination to move to equilibrium. Why? Because we know that. We're comfortable with it. It doesn't cause us to do anything that's radical. So we have to be careful about this. And what he's saying here is that we need to keep the change momentum going forward. We used to use a term, or at least I used it many times when I was in the Army, keep moving forward. We don't want to stay where we are. So here he's talking about making sure that we recognize the people that have helped us affect the change and celebrate them, and to continue monitoring the external environment, because that may tell us what we need to do to change. Notice what he's talking about here. This is not only radical, but it is revolutionary, bringing in new people to help do what's needed to be done. And I wish I could give you where I got this, but when there is a change in CEOs of major companies, there's normally a 10 to 20% turnover of the senior executives within a year or two after the new CEO comes. And much of that could be that the CEO wants to bring his or her own team. It could be that the CEO says, hey, you know, we need to think differently about this, and the person doesn't want to think differently about it. So that is a radical change. How much that affects an organization, it's difficult to say. But we all know that new blood, new thinkers make us stop and think about what we're doing, because it affects our comfort zone. So we need to be open to those type things. Notice what he's saying here is, after the change has been effected and it's now in place, we have to go back and see if we don't need to do other things, new initiatives that line up with what we originally did. If the external environment has not changed, or, excuse me, are in line with a new external environment if change has occurred. So this is, again, a monitoring type thing. And finally, And sustaining change, again, we're launching new initiatives. And notice he is back again talking about not allowing equilibrium to take over. Point is to survive. So our lecture discussion question for this evening is, in your own words, why is equilibrium dangerous? Again, the lecture discussion question for this evening is, why, in your own words, is equilibrium dangerous? Please be sure to support your assertion of why equilibrium is dangerous. I thank you for your attention tonight. I apologize for the technical issues. I'll try to have the lecture uploaded as soon tomorrow as possible. Thank you for your attention and good evening.